The chronically angry individual is not a cynical realist. They are a delusional emotional infant. Their rage is a symptom of pathological optimism, a stubborn refusal to accept the mathematical certainty of chaos. Friction is the default condition of the human experience. They are angry because they simply refuse to grieve. But here is the brutal physical reality. Look at the commuter trapped in unexpected, standstill traffic. They grip the synthetic leather of the steering wheel. They squeeze until the knuckles blanch completely dry of blood. The jaw clenches and releases repeatedly. You can physically see the masseter muscle rapidly contracting under the skin. Watch closely how they react. Their gaze darts between the stationary metal box ahead and the digital dashboard clock, a manic visual pivot occurring exactly every 12 seconds. Their respiratory rate becomes shallow and erratic. They mutter repetitive, staccato expletives into the empty cabin. They sharply tap the glass of the GPS screen. They jab their finger into the pixels. They are attempting to physically intimidate an algorithmic reality, demanding the physical laws of traffic bend to their immediate schedule. The actual fatal mechanism is baffling. Why does the human nervous system do this? Why expend massive amounts of irreplaceable caloric energy? Why systematically spike lethal levels of circulating stress hormones? All to fight a physical reality that is mathematically impossible to alter. Anger is not a personality trait. It is a fundamental biological protest against universal entropy. Your brain harbors a lethal evolutionary flaw. It operates under the false expectation that the world is inherently orderly. It assumes the environment is actively designed with your biological convenience in mind. When this naive delusion inevitably shatters, the biological system panics. Let us look at the exact neural cascade. Deep within the midbrain lies the ventral tegmental area. This region constantly calculates expected outcomes and future probabilities. It acts as a ruthless internal accountant. It drips dopamine into your system based on a highly specific predicted future. You expect to find your keys exactly where you left them. You expect a complex sequence of traffic lights to turn green exactly as you approach. When physical reality fails to deliver this precise, calculated outcome, the internal math breaks. Neurologists classify this as a negative prediction error. Your dopamine levels crash to absolute zero in a fraction of a millisecond. This sudden chemical vacuum triggers an immediate, visceral distress signal. The signal fires directly into the amygdala at terrifying speeds. The brain suddenly registers a neutral, minor inconvenience as an acute, lethal survival threat. But here is where the pathology truly forms. Sadness and grief are withdrawal-motivated emotions. They are linked to the right frontal cortex. They forcibly mandate the organism to accept external loss. Anger operates entirely differently. Anger is strictly an approach-motivated emotion. The brain aggressively activates the left frontal hemisphere. It artificially manufactures a sudden, violent sense of agency within the body. By shifting into a state of rage, the organism builds a temporary psychological shield. It creates a strict neurological illusion of control over an entirely uncontrollable environment. It tricks itself into believing it can dominate chaotic variables through sheer physical tension. This is a desperate biological maneuver to stave off the crushing vulnerability of despair. Watch this exact mechanism play out in a sterile environment. An individual is assembling flat-pack furniture on a living room floor. A mass-produced metal screw fails to perfectly align with a pre-drilled hole. The physical friction is microscopic, but the brain completely rejects the sensory data. The individual forcefully drives the screwdriver downward. They apply excessive, unnecessary kinetic energy. They strip the metal thread completely bare. They stand up abruptly from the floor, disrupting their center of gravity. They hurl the heavy metal tool directly onto the hardwood surface. They pace back and forth across the room in sharp, erratic, angular movements. They stop and stare directly at the inanimate wooden board. Their pupils dilate drastically. This is a sympathetic nervous response to let in more light for impending physical combat. The corrugator supercilii muscle contracts fiercely. It pulls the brow severely downward. They are physically preparing their biological hardware to fight a dead piece of pine. And it gets worse. This hallucination carries a massive physiological price tag. It triggers the rapid, violent exhaustion of the central nervous system. The organism rapidly burns through irreplaceable neurological resources. It permanently empties adrenal reserves, attempting to dominate irreversible, inanimate events. The inevitable physical result is chronic, inescapable cognitive fatigue. The physical hardware is literally burning itself out, trying to control the mathematically uncontrollable. But how does the brain's internal software actually execute this lie? How does the neural circuitry convert a neutral piece of wood or a red light into an active, malicious enemy? The external universe does not attack you. Human cognitive faculties manually manufacture the attack. They do this through faulty, unmonitored appraisal algorithms. Every external stimulus is entirely neutral. The rage you experience is a purely synthetic creation. Sensory input enters the brain through the thalamus. From here, the brain physically splits the data into two distinct neurological routes. The first route is the high road. Data travels from the thalamus directly to the sensory cortex. This allows for logical, measured, conscious processing of the environment. The second route is the low road. Data bypasses logic entirely and shoots from the thalamus straight into the amygdala. In individuals prone to chronic anger, a severe mechanical failure occurs right here. The prefrontal cortex completely fails to inhibit this low road. The brain skips conscious evaluation entirely. It immediately labels a mathematically neutral stimulus as an acute existential threat. This triggers a severe cognitive distortion known as hostile attribution bias. The human ego is fundamentally incapable of processing the sheer randomness of reality. To compensate, the neural circuitry physically projects malicious intent onto chaotic events. It categorizes a completely random misfortune as a deliberate, targeted injustice. This is a desperate computational effort to maintain a highly specific narrative, a narrative where the individual remains the absolute focal point of the universe. Watch closely how this distortion dictates physical behavior. An office worker sits at a desk and opens a new digital message. The email from a superior contains exactly 3 words. Review this document. In a fraction of a second, the worker's heart rate spikes from a resting 70 to 110 beats per minute. Their respiratory rate quickens immediately. It shifts from deep diaphragmatic intakes to rapid, shallow chest breathing. Blood flow is restricted from the digestive tract and pushed to the extremities. They narrow their eyes, intensely fixating on the glowing monitor. They aggressively strike the mechanical keyboard. They type out a highly defensive, excessively over-explained response. The biological system has completely misinterpreted the data. It processed the absence of a greeting or a typographical exclamation point as a calculated attack. It registered empty digital space as an aggressive, deliberate insult to their professional competence. The actual fatal mechanism is the complete detachment from objective reality. The individual begins to live entirely inside a fabricated, isolated hallucination. Every neutral variable becomes a lethal threat. Every minor delay or mechanical inconvenience is perceived as an active, breathing predator. And it gets worse. When the brain remains locked in this hallucinatory state of constant warfare, the biological hardware eventually collapses. It physically degrades under the sheer weight of its own defensive payload. Sustained anger is an evolutionary misfire. It is a catastrophic failure of human adaptation to modern environments. In the short term, it protects the fragile ego. It forcefully deflects the paralyzing weight of acute sadness. But long-term exposure completely destroys the biological hardware. It permanently severs the organism's capacity to perceive reality. It obliterates the ability to process complex information accurately. Let us trace the exact path of this neurobiological burnout. Chronic anger demands the continuous, unrelenting activation of the HPA axis. The hypothalamus constantly signals the pituitary gland. The pituitary commands the adrenal glands to fire without any scheduled rest. The biological system is continuously flooded with toxic levels of cortisol. It is saturated with dangerously high volumes of circulating norepinephrine. Over time, this relentless chemical exposure alters the brain's physical structure. It aggressively down-regulates glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus. The brain physically deletes its own biochemical brakes. It becomes entirely resistant to its own natural, internal calming mechanisms. The central nervous system is permanently locked into a state of hypervigilance. And it gets worse. The brain must survive this neurotoxic bath of sustained stress hormones. To physically protect itself from cellular death, it begins a brutal neural pruning process. It physically severs the delicate pathways associated with nuanced emotional processing. The circuits responsible for empathy, complex grief, and vulnerability are systematically shut down. The individual develops severe secondary alexithymia. This is a highly specific, clinical inability to identify or describe internal states. They completely lose the underlying neurological vocabulary required to feel deeply. They are left with only one accessible emotional output: baseline, unmitigated, reflexive aggression. Watch closely how they react in a true emotional crisis. A parent receives a phone call from a school administrator. They are informed of their child's severe psychological and social struggles. Look at the parent's physical response. There is absolutely no softening of the facial features. There is no empathetic drop in vocal pitch or cadence. They ask zero exploratory questions to gather objective data. Instead, the facial muscles remain completely rigid. The parent stands physically over the seated, crying child. They deliver a monotone volume, escalating lecture. They do not visually register the child's tears. They do not notice the child physically shrinking into the geometry of the chair. The parent's neurological system simply cannot process complex empathy. It literally lacks the active neural hardware to do so. It automatically defaults to outputting raw, unfiltered aggression. This is the only remaining biological protocol to maintain its own precarious equilibrium. The actual fatal mechanism is the complete calcification of the psyche. The individual is effectively dead to the nuanced world. They operate solely as a reactive, highly defensive biological machine, a hostile mechanism that systematically alienates every single human being in its physical proximity. If our default biology inevitably drives us toward this self-destructive cycle, if we are mechanically destined for naive optimism and neurological burnout, what is the exact physical mechanism to override our own neurochemistry? The ultimate, inescapable truth is this: human anger is mathematically useless against universal entropy. The external universe does not single you out for punishment. It simply does not possess the capacity to know you exist. Suffering, ignorance, and friction are not temporary anomalies. They are the fundamental, default operating conditions of physical reality. True psychological dominance requires a brutal, uncompromising cognitive sacrifice. You must engineer the absolute death of your inner optimist. You must immediately stop demanding that the vast universe bend to your microscopic dopamine requirements. Recognize your rage for exactly what it is: a severe biological liability, a catastrophic failure of your own internal sensory filtration system. But there is a strict mechanical protocol to override this biological destiny. You must implement deliberate, cognitive pre-appraisal, the discipline of premeditatio malorum. Every single morning, you must actively visualize the inevitable, spectacular failures of the upcoming day. Pre-calculate the exact duration of standstill traffic down to the minute. Factor in the precise, predictable incompetence of your colleagues. Anticipate the sudden, unexplainable mechanical failure of your digital tools. By doing this, you manually preload the negative reward prediction error. You deliberately drain the chemical expectation down to absolute zero before the event ever actually occurs. This starves the midbrain of expectation. It keeps the amygdala completely dormant when the chaos actually arrives. When a sudden, unpredicted stimulus does somehow breach this defense, you must act instantly. Force a strict 10-second parasympathetic breathing pattern. Make your exhalations exactly twice as long as your forced inhalations. This highly specific physical action directly engages the vagus nerve. It manually blockades the impending cortisol spike. You literally intercept the chemical distress signal before the low road can hijack your prefrontal cortex. The physical world will never adapt to your biological expectations. You either master your internal cognitive algorithms, or you remain a blind, exhausted puppet to your own biology. Subscribe to this channel if you are ready to completely dismantle your illusions. And finally, understand the uncompromising mechanics of human nature.